Hello and welcome to the Noob's Nook. This is going to be a collaborative creatives corner. I love making things. I have loved it as far back as I can remember, from sketching in my little doodle pads, to building models, to getting into cosplay, to getting into Dungeons and Dragons, to writing, to painting, to the whole shebang. I love making things. 2 hard thumbs up. But I keep having friends tell me I can't make this. I can't do this because of the money, because of a lack of experience, because of a lack of creativity, or rather a perceived lack of creativity, because honestly, I just don't believe that people aren't creative. Everybody has that creative urge. Everybody can make something pretty. And as a nerd, everyone can make something pretty. Everyone can make something that's really cool. So, getting a little bit into my personal backstory of getting into creative. I started the way most people did, I think, doodling in a notepad. And a friend of mine, female friend actually, who had come to the United States at that time, noticed that I was doodling, got into a conversation with me. Before I knew it, I am getting into what I think most people's gateway into Warhammer 40K. And this is a more recently painted model than back then. I don't really have any models from when I started out. This is about 20 years worth of practice going in to making something like that, or like this, which are just bog standard models made by Games Workshop. Now, I started off with that. That wasn't quite enough for me. I progressed on to what I think most people do when they've started with Warhammer, which is, all right, I've got models. I like my models. I want my models to stand out. So I got into what basically everyone does, conversions. Now, I started off with fairly simple conversions, which are using a whole bunch of Games Workshop parts combined with a couple of other elements. So, for example, there's some guitar wire along here and coming out the front of the face here. See that? Guitar wire right there. But the vast majority of these are just onesie-twosie parts that I've taken from other model kits and just kit bashed together to make something cool. In this case, a Skitarii. I did this before they came out with the Adeptus Mechanicus armies, which, whole lot of work putting into making these models, and they just come out with the dang army afterwards, which they look pretty, but what you gonna do? And then I kind of went from there and went, well, heck, if I'm already going through all the trouble of using other people's stuff, why don't I make my own? So I started getting into making things that were sculpted entirely from plastic sculpting putty. For example, this is a Greater Demon of Tzeentch made entirely from sculpting putty. I made this guy 10 years ago, and frankly, although he looks good at a distance, as you get in close, there's some fairly janky stuff about him. I mean, the teeth, they look exactly the way that you'd expect them to look for someone who's doing a first attempt. Sort of roly nonsense. Making demons is pretty forgiving, though, because people, especially for Tzeentch or Nurgle, just associate a lot of the oddities of creating the model as being inherently demonic traits. I've since progressed from this point, but I don't want to get into that sort of stuff until we start talking about the green stuff sculpting lecture. That'll come at a later date. And then eventually I hit a point where, don't get me wrong, love Games Workshop. Still buy Games Workshop, still build Games Workshop, but it got a little pricey. So I thought, well, heck, if I'm going to spend that amount of money why don't I get some stuff that's really cool? So I started branching out into other science fiction and fantasy universes. So these are West Wind, Babylon 5 models. They're discontinued now, but they were really cool at the time. This is Vorlon, Mimbari. And in fact, on this YouTube channel, in addition to reviewing standard products and talking through the standard pitfalls of what happens when you make something that looks fairly pretty, it's fairly well put together, you end up combining it with the wrong products. Kind of see how that glass got all smoky? Can't see anything in there. We'll be talking about how that happened and how you can avoid it. And I'll also be talking about third-party miniature makers. Things that aren't Games Workshop, things that aren't part of what the standard big two miniature producers are. Like Cyborg, who makes some fairly good stuff that we'll go into at a later date. As well as some miniature makers that I'm sure you do recognize as third-party miniature makers. And some producers of miniatures that you might recognize. To some producers that I'm sure you most definitely will not. If you do, kudos to you. I only recently found these guys, and I can dig fairly deep down that rabbit hole. By the way, you may have noticed all three of these miniatures are female miniatures. As a Dungeons & Dragons gamer, I like to keep my table as diverse as possible and as interesting as possible, and as kind of across the cultural gambit as I can keep it, just because I want to have my campaigns as open to as many possible plot lines as things can go down. If my players end up deciding that they're going to go into China in medieval times, I better find a medieval Chinese noblewoman real quick. Or I better find a cool Kaylee-style airship mechanic. And just in general, my village needs some peasants. But we're not just going to be talking about this fairly standard fanfare. We'll also be talking in terms of third-party producers of miniatures for movies and television shows that you know and love. This is a quick preview of things to come in my Fallout 4 video. Okay, it's Fallout in general, but I love Fallout 4, so I know, Fallout 2, Fallout 3, supposed to be a purist, but I really liked Fallout 4. I don't know why I like that more. I'm broken. We'll also be talking through a lot of tools of the trade. From the very basic tools, like your knives and your mats, and talking about basic cost-cutting measures, so that you end up spending $10 on something that you can get from a dollar store or Walmart, instead of going crazy buying something that is comparatively tiny, just so you can get a pretty little logo on it. And we'll be talking through other tools of the trade, starting with fairly cheap brushes, branching out to slightly more expensive, branching out to the outright expensive, and making our way into the profane. Brushes can cost an insane amount of money if you let them, in spite of the fact that something may be a third of the price will do more or less the same job. We'll talk through that. We'll also talk through some of the fun tools. From the dice I'm sure you already have, to the dice I'm sure you want to have. And we'll see if these will show off for the camera. Both of you go to dice jail. as well as talking through some of the pricier tools that as you get into this process, you may not end up wanting to spend money on. From tools that are relatively inexpensive but useful, to tools that are more expensive but find themselves finding more and more ways into your life and that last more over time, to things that are an outright investment. As well as talking through some frankly esoteric tools of the trade. If you know what this is, I love you. And talking our way through some things in the studio I have that I love and I cannot get enough use out of. To some rotten things I've spent money on that I couldn't find a use for if I wanted to. Bear in mind, these are my personal thoughts, these are my personal preferences, and these are the result of a large amount of time I've spent in my studio. Please do not take these as gospel. If you have a better way of doing things, if you can show me a better way of doing things, please bring it to the table. This is a collaborative corner, and if you can show me a better way of doing things, I would be very happy either to share it through my channel or to link to your channel so that my viewers can get more skills, more talents. I want to Bob Ross this up, so we're just going to make happy little trees and happy little accidents until everyone knows how to do things pretty on their table. So, happy gaming.